When people ask me how I caught the groom with a bridesmaid at my wedding and ended up marrying his father instead, I tell them it's a story about justice served ice cold. But the truth is more complicated than that. It's about the moment when everything you thought you knew about love, trust, and your entire future crumbles into ash, and you have to decide whether to let it bury you or use those ashes to fertilize something new. The morning of my wedding day, I woke up with butterflies dancing in my stomach and sunlight streaming through the hotel curtains. After 3 years with Marcus, I was finally going to become Mrs. Harrison. The dress hung like a promise on the closet door, ivory silk catching the golden light. My phone buzzed with congratulations from friends who couldn't make it, and I felt that dizzy, surreal happiness that comes with dreams actually coming true. I should have known it was too perfect. The venue was everything I'd dreamed of: rolling green lawns, white chairs arranged in perfect rows, flowers that cost more than my first car. Marcus's family had spared no expense, his father Robert insisting on handling most of the arrangements. At the time, I thought it was generous. Now I realize Robert Harrison is a man who understands the value of making investments in people he genuinely cares about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The ceremony was scheduled for 4 o'clock. By 2:30, I was in my dress, veil pinned perfectly in place, makeup applied with artistic precision. The photographer was capturing every detail: the delicate beading on my bodice, the way the cathedral train spread behind me like spilled cream. My hands were shaking slightly, but I attributed it to normal pre-wedding nerves. My maid of honor, Sarah, kept checking her phone and glancing toward the door with an expression I couldn't quite read. When I asked if everything was okay, she just smiled and said the groomsmen were probably having pre-ceremony jitters too. The bridesmaids were bustling around, touching up lipstick and adjusting bouquets. Everything seemed normal, yet something felt off in a way I couldn't pinpoint. At 3:15, I decided I needed a moment alone. The bridal suite felt suffocating with all the chatter and last-minute preparations. I told Sarah I was going to step outside for some air, maybe walk to the garden area behind the venue to calm my nerves. She nodded absently, still focused on her phone. The afternoon was perfect. Warm but not hot, with a gentle breeze that wouldn't disturb my carefully arranged hair. I walked slowly in my heels, careful not to catch the train on anything, breathing in the scent of roses and jasmine. The gardens were separated from the main venue by a hedge-lined path, creating intimate alcoves perfect for wedding photos. That's when I heard it. A woman's laugh, breathy and intimate. Then Marcus's voice, lower than usual, saying something that made her giggle again. My heart clenched with a weird mixture of curiosity and dread. Maybe he was just joking around with one of the bridesmaids. Maybe they were practicing some surprise they had planned for the reception. I moved closer, my silk shoes silent on the stone path. The voices were coming from the gazebo tucked behind the rose garden, the same gazebo where we'd planned to take our first photos as husband and wife. Through the latticed walls, I could see them. Marcus had his hands on Emma's waist. Emma, my youngest bridesmaid, my college roommate who'd introduced us in the first place. Her bridesmaid dress was pushed up around her hips, his tuxedo jacket discarded on the gazebo floor. They weren't just talking. They weren't practicing anything except infidelity. The world didn't stop. That's what people always say happens in moments like this, but it's not true. The world kept spinning, birds kept singing, my heart kept beating. But something inside me crystallized into sharp, clear understanding. This wasn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. The way they moved together, the familiarity of their hands on each other, the intimate way she whispered his name, this had been going on for a while. How long? Weeks? Months? Had they been laughing about me behind my back while I planned our future? While I picked out flowers and tasted cakes and wrote vows about forever? I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, watching my fiancé betray me with my friend 30 minutes before our wedding. Emma had helped me shop for lingerie for the honeymoon. She'd been at my bachelorette party, toasting to my happiness while apparently sleeping with my future husband. The details seared themselves into my memory with cruel clarity. The way Marcus's hands tangled in her dark hair. The small moan she made when he kissed her neck. The complete lack of guilt or urgency in their movements, as if they had all the time in the world instead of being 25 minutes away from my walking down the aisle. Finally, I stepped back. My hands were steady now, the shaking completely gone. Something cold and analytical had taken over, pushing the emotional devastation into a locked room I could deal with later. Right now I needed to think. I walked back toward the venue, my mind racing through options. I could burst in there screaming, make a scene, humiliate them both. I could call off the wedding, send everyone home, and deal with the shame and embarrassment later. I could pretend I hadn't seen anything and go through with the ceremony, then confront them afterward. Or I could do something smarter. 200 people were waiting for this wedding. Both families were there, some having traveled from across the country. The vendors were paid, the flowers were arranged, the cake was ready. Most importantly, Marcus's family was there, including Robert Harrison, the man who'd welcomed me with open arms from the very beginning and treated me like the daughter he'd never had. Robert was the kind of man who commanded respect without demanding it. At 55, he'd built his father's small construction business into an empire worth 8 figures. He was sophisticated, intelligent, and had an integrity his son apparently hadn't inherited. During our engagement, he'd often expressed how happy he was that Marcus had found someone who brought out his better nature. Apparently, my presence hadn't brought out Marcus's better nature quite as much as his father had hoped. I made it back to the bridal suite without anyone noticing I'd left. Sarah looked up from her phone with a bright smile and asked if I was feeling better. I told her yes, much better actually. Everything was becoming very clear. The next 15 minutes were surreal. I stood there while everyone fussed around me, adjusting my veil one final time, touching up the lipstick that had stayed perfect since I hadn't kissed anyone today, unlike my groom. The photographer took more pictures of me looking radiant and happy. If you look at those photos now, you can see something different in my eyes, but everyone else just saw a beautiful bride ready for her perfect day. At 5 minutes to 4, there was a knock on the door. Robert Harrison stepped in, looking distinguished in his charcoal gray suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. He'd offered to walk me down the aisle since my father had passed away 2 years earlier. At the time, it had seemed like a sweet gesture. Now it felt like fate. He smiled warmly and offered me his arm, telling me I looked absolutely stunning. His eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, genuine affection radiating from him. This was a man who meant what he said, who valued honesty and loyalty above everything else. As we walked toward the doors that would open onto the ceremony, I made my decision. But not the decision anyone expected. I stopped just before we reached the doors and looked up at Robert. He raised an eyebrow, probably thinking I was having last-minute jitters. Instead, I told him there was something he needed to know before we went out there. Something about his son? The color drained from his face as I explained, in calm, measured tones, what I'd witnessed 20 minutes earlier. I watched him process the information, saw the disappointment and anger flicker across his features, before settling into resignation. This wasn't the first time Marcus had let him down, I realized. But it was probably the most public and humiliating. When I finished speaking, Robert was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked what I wanted to do. His voice was gentle, concerned entirely for my well-being rather than the embarrassment this would cause his family. That's when I knew Robert Harrison was exactly the kind of man I'd thought he was. I told him I wasn't going to marry Marcus today, obviously, but I also wasn't going to humiliate him or Emma in front of everyone. Instead, I had a different idea. The ceremony proceeded, but not as planned. Robert walked me down the aisle as arranged, but when we reached the altar, instead of taking my place beside Marcus, I turned to face our guests. Marcus looked confused, Emma looked terrified from her position with the other bridesmaids, and everyone else looked expectantly happy. I spoke clearly, my voice carrying to the back rows. I thanked everyone for coming to celebrate what should have been the happiest day of my life. I told them how much their presence meant to me, how touched I was that they'd traveled here to witness what they thought would be the beginning of my marriage. Then I explained that sometimes life presents us with unexpected revelations that change everything we thought we knew. I'd learned something today that made it impossible for me to marry Marcus, but I didn't want their time and effort to be wasted. Instead of a wedding, we were going to have a party. The dinner was prepared, the band was ready, and the bar was fully stocked. I hoped they would all stay and celebrate life, love, and the importance of honesty in relationships. Marcus started to speak, but I held up my hand. I told him we would talk later, privately, but right now I needed him to respect my decision and help me salvage something positive from this situation for our families and friends. The crowd was stunned, but Robert immediately stepped forward and began graciously explaining that while the circumstances were unexpected, everyone was still welcome to enjoy the evening. His social skills were impressive, turning what could have been an awkward disaster into something that felt almost elegant. As people began to murmur and move toward the reception area, Emma slipped away from the bridesmaids. I watched her go without saying a word. There would be time to deal with her later. Marcus finally found his voice and demanded to know what was going on. His face was red with embarrassment and anger, but I could see the fear underneath. He knew exactly what was going on. I told him simply that I'd seen him with Emma in the gazebo. His face went white, then flushed again as he started to stammer excuses. I stopped him by explaining that this conversation was going to happen once, privately, tomorrow. Tonight was about salvaging the evening for everyone who'd come here in good faith. Then I walked away from him, my train flowing behind me like a victory banner. The reception was actually wonderful. After the initial shock wore off, people seemed to embrace the unusual circumstances. The fact that I'd handled everything with such grace, that I'd chosen to spare everyone an ugly scene, seemed to earn me respect and sympathy. Story after story reached me of people saying they admired my strength, my dignity, my consideration for others even in such a painful moment. Robert stayed close to me throughout the evening, making sure I was okay, deflecting the more intrusive questions from curious relatives. His presence was steadying, comforting in a way that made me realize how much I was going to miss having him as a father-in-law. Late in the evening, as the party was winding down, Robert and I found ourselves alone on the terrace overlooking the gardens. The lights strung through the trees cast everything in a warm, golden glow. He apologized for his son's behavior, his voice heavy with disappointment and genuine regret. I told him it wasn't his fault, that he'd raised Marcus with good values and strong examples. Some people just choose not to follow them. We talked about betrayal, about disappointment, about the difference between the people we think we know and who they really are. That's when I realized Robert Harrison wasn't just a good man. He was the man I'd thought Marcus was when I fell in love. Kind, intelligent, successful, with integrity that ran bone deep. He was also handsome in a mature, distinguished way that Marcus would probably never achieve, even at 60. More importantly, he was clearly lonely. His wife had died 5 years earlier, and while he'd thrown himself into work and philanthropy, there was an emptiness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Over the next several weeks, Robert and I stayed in touch. It started innocently enough. He called to check on me, to make sure I was handling everything okay. He helped me navigate the practical matters of canceling a honeymoon, returning gifts, and dealing with vendors. His assistance was invaluable, and his company was surprisingly comforting. Marcus, meanwhile, had completely fallen apart. He'd called, texted, shown up at my apartment begging for forgiveness. He claimed Emma had seduced him, that it was just physical, that he'd made a terrible mistake but truly loved only me. The desperation in his voice was almost satisfying. Emma had apparently been equally frantic, calling and crying about how sorry she was, how it had just happened, how she never meant to hurt me. I listened to exactly one of her voicemails before blocking her number. I wasn't interested in her excuses or her guilt, but I was very interested in Robert Harrison. Our conversations grew longer, deeper. He was fascinating, well-traveled, well-read, with stories from his business dealings and insights into human nature that came from decades of experience. Unlike his son, Robert actually listened when I spoke. He asked thoughtful questions, remembered details from previous conversations, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and opinions. When he invited me to dinner 6 weeks after the non-wedding, I said yes immediately. It felt natural, comfortable, right in a way my relationship with Marcus never had. That first dinner lasted 4 hours, conversation flowing effortlessly from topic to topic. When he walked me to my door, the goodnight kiss was inevitable and perfect. Marcus found out about our relationship 2 months later when a friend spotted us at the opera together. His reaction was exactly what I'd expected: explosive, possessive, and completely hypocritical. He accused me of dating his father to get revenge, of trying to hurt him, of being manipulative and cruel. I told him that my relationship with Robert had nothing to do with him, which was mostly true. The fact that it drove Marcus absolutely insane was just a very pleasant side effect. Robert, for his part, was concerned about the optics of our relationship. He worried people would think he was taking advantage of me in a vulnerable time, or that I was using him to get back at Marcus. We had long conversations about our motivations, our feelings, and what we wanted from each other. The truth was complicated. Yes, there was an element of poetic justice in the situation that I found deeply satisfying. Marcus had betrayed me with someone he thought I trusted, so there was a certain symmetry in me finding genuine happiness with someone he loved and respected. But my feelings for Robert were real and had nothing to do with revenge. He was everything Marcus wasn't: mature, stable, thoughtful, and completely devoted to the people he cared about. When Robert looked at me, I felt valued and cherished in a way Marcus had never made me feel, even in our best moments. With Marcus, I'd always felt like I was competing for his attention. With Robert, I felt like I was his priority. The physical attraction was undeniable too. Robert was distinguished rather than conventionally handsome, but there was something incredibly appealing about his confidence, his presence, the way he carried himself. He was a man who knew exactly who he was and what he wanted, and he wanted me. Our relationship progressed naturally over the following months. Robert introduced me to his world: business dinners, charity galas, cultural events, and I fit in seamlessly. His friends and associates welcomed me warmly, many commenting on how happy I made him, how much lighter and more relaxed he seemed. Marcus continued to spiral. Losing me had apparently triggered some kind of existential crisis, and he wasn't handling it well. He'd broken up with Emma within days of our non-wedding, claiming he'd never really cared about her. He was drinking more, working less, and generally making a mess of his life. Robert tried to help his son, but Marcus was beyond reasoning with. Every conversation between them devolved into accusations and arguments, with Marcus blaming his father for stealing his fiancée, and Robert pointing out that Marcus had forfeited any claim to me when he decided to cheat on our wedding day. 10 months after that disastrous wedding day, Robert proposed. He did it right. Private dinner at the restaurant where we'd had our first date, a ring that was sophisticated and elegant rather than flashy, words that were sincere and heartfelt. He told me he loved me for who I was, not who he thought I could become. He said I'd brought joy back into his life when he'd thought that chapter was closed forever. He promised to cherish, respect, and protect me for as long as he lived. This time, when I said yes, I meant it completely. Our wedding was small, intimate, and perfect. Just close family and friends, held in Robert's backyard garden with simple, elegant decorations and food catered by our favorite restaurant. Everything about it was the opposite of my first almost wedding: genuine instead of performative, meaningful instead of elaborate. Marcus didn't attend, obviously. He sent a bitter letter expressing his disappointment in both of us, accusing us of betraying him and ruining the family. Robert read it once, then put it away without comment. He'd given his son every opportunity to be part of our lives, but Marcus had chosen anger over acceptance. Emma had moved across the country shortly after everything fell apart. Mutual friends occasionally updated me on her life, but I felt nothing about her anymore. Not anger, not hurt, not even satisfaction at her apparent unhappiness. She'd become irrelevant the moment I chose my own path forward. The first year of my marriage to Robert was everything I'd dreamed marriage could be. We traveled together, worked on house projects, hosted dinner parties for our friends. He supported my career ambitions and encouraged me to go back to school for the advanced degree I'd put on hold during my relationship with Marcus. Robert was an active, engaged partner who made decisions with me rather than for me. When I mentioned wanting to redecorate the living room, he handed me his credit card and told me to make it ours. When I got frustrated with my job, he listened to me vent and helped me strategize solutions rather than just offering empty platitudes. We were building a real partnership, a genuine marriage based on mutual respect and shared values. The age difference that some people whispered about felt completely irrelevant. We were both adults who'd found each other at the right time in our lives. Marcus eventually stopped trying to contact us, though mutual friends kept us updated on his continued struggles. He'd been through several relationships, none lasting more than a few months. His work performance had declined to the point where Robert had to consider removing him from important projects. He was becoming the kind of man Robert had always feared he might become: entitled, unreliable, and bitter. A year and a half after our wedding, I found out I was pregnant. The joy on Robert's face when I told him was something I'll never forget. He'd always wanted more children, but assumed that opportunity had passed. Now, at 57, he was going to be a father again. He immediately started planning, talking about converting the spare room into a nursery, researching the best schools, worrying about being too old to keep up with a baby. I assured him that experience and patience were more valuable than youth, and that our child was going to be incredibly lucky to have him as a father. Unlike Marcus, Robert had always put family first. He'd built his business success around being present for important moments, and I knew he'd be the same way as a father. When Marcus found out about the pregnancy through family gossip, he had what his relatives described as a complete meltdown. Apparently, the idea of his father having a child with his ex-fiancée was the final insult he couldn't bear. He made several drunken phone calls to Robert, alternately begging for forgiveness and hurling accusations. Robert listened to one of these calls on speakerphone while I was in the room. Hearing Marcus sob about how we'd destroyed his life, how he'd lost everything, how unfair it all was, I felt something I hadn't expected: pity. He'd done this to himself. Every choice, every consequence, every loss had been the result of his own actions. We hadn't destroyed his life. He'd imploded it by choosing momentary pleasure over lasting commitment. But he was still Robert's son, and his pain was real, even if it was self-inflicted. After that call, Robert made one final attempt to reconcile with Marcus. He invited him to lunch and offered to help him get back on track, personally and professionally. But Marcus was too deep in his own resentment and self-pity to accept the olive branch. He accused Robert of trying to buy his forgiveness and stormed out of the restaurant. That was the last time they spoke. Our daughter was born on a sunny Tuesday morning in May. Lily Harrison came into the world healthy, beautiful, and absolutely perfect. Watching Robert hold her for the first time, seeing the wonder and love in his eyes, I felt a completeness I hadn't known was possible. This was what family was supposed to feel like. Not the performative drama I'd experienced with Marcus, where every milestone felt like a photo opportunity, but quiet, deep contentment. Love that didn't need to announce itself because it was woven into every daily interaction. As I sit here now, 3 years into my marriage to Robert and 2 years into motherhood, people still occasionally ask me about revenge. They want to know if I married my ex-fiancé's father to get back at him, if the whole relationship is some elaborate scheme for vengeance. The answer is complicated. Did I enjoy the poetic justice of the situation? Absolutely. Was there satisfaction in knowing that Marcus's betrayal had ultimately led me to something infinitely better? Of course. Do I still feel a small, dark pleasure when I hear about his continued struggles, while my life has become everything I'd hoped it would be? I'm human, so yes. But revenge implies that my choices were primarily about hurting Marcus, and that's not true. Every decision I made was about building the life I wanted, not destroying the one he had. The fact that my happiness coincidentally became his torment is just one of life's more elegant ironies. Marcus chose immediate gratification over lasting commitment. I chose to build something real with someone who valued me completely. He chose to betray trust. I chose to find someone worthy of mine. He chose to blame everyone else for the consequences of his actions. I chose to take responsibility for my own happiness. The revenge, if you want to call it that, wasn't planned or orchestrated. It was simply the natural result of choosing differently than he did. Robert and I are happy. Genuinely, deeply, lastingly happy. We're building a family, a legacy, a partnership that gets stronger every year. Lily is growing up with a father who adores her and prioritizes her well-being above everything else. We have a community of friends and colleagues who respect and support us. Marcus, meanwhile, is still single, still struggling professionally, still angry at a world he thinks has treated him unfairly. His last social media post was a bitter rant about how success is all about connections and luck rather than merit. He works for his father's company, but has been relegated to minor projects because Robert can't trust him with anything important. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never seen him with Emma that day. Would we have gone through with the wedding? Would I have discovered his infidelity later, after we were legally bound together? Would I have spent years in a marriage where I was competing for attention and settling for less than I deserved? But mostly, I don't think about alternative timelines. I'm too busy living the one where everything worked out exactly as it should have. The best revenge, it turns out, isn't elaborate schemes or dramatic confrontations. It's simply building a life so fulfilling, so genuinely joyful, that the person who hurt you becomes completely irrelevant to your happiness. And if that life happens to be everything they lost when they chose betrayal over loyalty, well, that's just karma working its magic in the most beautiful way possible. When I catch my reflection in the mirror these days, I see a woman who knows her worth and refuses to settle for less. I see someone who turned the worst betrayal of her life into the foundation for something infinitely better. I see Robert's wife, Lily's mother, and my own person, complete, confident, and deeply content. Marcus gave me the greatest gift he could have given me, though he'll never see it that way. He showed me who he really was before I legally bound my life to his, and in doing so, he set me free to find someone infinitely better. So when people ask me how I ended up married to my ex-fiancé's father, I tell them it's a love story. The revenge part was just a happy coincidence.